The dust of redemption, Texas, tasted of shame. It coated Alara's tongue, a gritty film of grit and judgment that was thicker than the afternoon heat. It clung to the sweat on her brow and the tears that had long since dried on her cheeks, leaving faint, salty trails through the grime. She stood on the splintered planks of the auction block, a makeshift stage of humiliation erected in the center of the town square, directly in front of the sheriff's office. Her wrists were bound loosely with a coarse rope, not tight enough to hurt, but tight enough to signify her status as property. A chattel, a debt to be settled. Her husband Samuel had been dead for 3 months, felled by a rattlesnake bite that had turned his leg black and his blood to fire. He had left her with a heart hollowed out by grief and a ledger book filled with debts he'd sworn were investments. The storekeeper, the blacksmith, the saloon owner, they had all come knocking, their faces grim with practiced sympathy that barely masked their impatience. But the largest debt, the one that had swallowed her small homestead whole, was to the man who now stood beside her, his shadow a suffocating blanket in the unforgiving sun. Sheriff Alistair Thorne. He was a man carved from the meanest parts of the frontier, with a belly that strained the buttons of his star-pinned vest and eyes like 2 chips of muddy ice. He held the ledger in one hand, smacking it against his palm with a rhythmic thud that echoed the frantic beat of Alara's heart. "As you all know," he began, his voice a gravelly drawl that carried across the silent, watching crowd, the late Samuel Vance was a dreamer, a man of grand plans and empty pockets. A few cruel chuckles rippled through the onlookers. Alara kept her eyes fixed on a loose board at her feet, counting the wood grains, trying to transport herself anywhere but here. She could feel their stares like physical blows, the women who had once shared recipes with her, now whispering behind their hands. The men whose leering eyes roamed her body, appraising her as they would a horse or a head of cattle. He left behind considerable debts to this fine community, Thorne continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing, with a possessive gleam, on Alara, and he left behind this. He gestured to her with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of casual dismissal that sent a fresh wave of heat rushing to her face. His widow, Alara. Now the law is the law. Debts must be paid. Her land, her home, her mule, they've all been sold, but it ain't enough. He paused, letting the drama hang in the thick air. So we find ourselves in a unique situation. He took a step closer, his sour breath washing over her. She flinched. What good is a woman like this? He mused, circling her slowly. She's no girl, fresh for the plucking. She's used goods, folks, warmed over. And what's worse? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet carrying, whisper. She's barren. 2 years married to Samuel, and not a single whelp to show for it. A fruitless vine. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Barren. He had said it. The secret shame she and Samuel had carried, the whispered prayers and bitter disappointments, now laid bare for the entire town to pick over like vultures on a carcass. A woman in the crowd gasped. A man snickered. The humiliation was a living thing, a serpent coiling in her gut, stealing her breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single hot tear finally breaking free and tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She prayed for the earth to open and swallow her. She prayed for a stray bolt of lightning from the clear blue sky. She prayed for Samuel to rise from his grave and strike this man down. But Thorne's voice boomed again, jolting her back. Every creature has its purpose. And a woman, even a used-up, barren one, can keep a house. She can cook. She can clean. She can warm a lonely man's bed on a cold night. His leer was unmistakable now, a greasy promise of the degradation to come. So that's what we're selling today, folks. Not the woman herself, that'd be illegal. He winked at the crowd. We're auctioning off a 1-year contract for domestic service. all her labor, all her comforts, to the highest bidder. To pay the final debt owed to me, your humble servant of the law. He raised his gavel. Let's start the bidding at $20. Who'll give me 20 for a year of wifely duties without the pesky burden of a wedding ring? Silence. Then a rough voice from the back called out, 20. It was Jed, the grimy fur trapper who lived in the hills and smelled of stale sweat and dead animals. I got 20. Who'll give me 25? Thorn grinned, his teeth yellowed and crooked. 25. Called out the saloon owner, a man whose hands were always damp and who had a habit of cornering his barmaids. Ilara's stomach churned. This was it. This was the end of her. She would be passed from man to man, a vessel for their lust and a drudge for their chores, until she was as worn out and discarded as her husband's old boots. The bidding climbed. 30, 35. Jed the trapper bid 40, his eyes gleaming with a feral hunger that made her skin crawl. Thorn was loving it, playing the crowd, his voice a carnival barker song of her demise. $40 from Mr. Jed. A fine price for a sturdy woman, even if her womb is gathering dust. Going once, going twice. Ilara braced herself. She thought of her mother's face, a gentle memory from a lifetime ago. Be strong, my little star, she had always said. But there was no strength left. There was only the dust and the shame and the leering eyes. 50. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. It was deep, calm, and steady. It came from the edge of the crowd, from a place where the shadows of the blacksmith's forge met the blinding sunlight. The crowd stirred, turning. As one to find the source, Ilara's gaze followed theirs. A man stood there, half hidden in the shade. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in simple, worn-clothes denim trousers, a faded chambray shirt, and a dusty, wide-brimmed hat. That shadowed his face. He wasn't a townsman. She had never seen him before. He stood with a stillness that was unnerving, a stark contrast to the fidgeting, murmuring crowd. He seemed rooted to the earth, a silent, unmovable part of the landscape. Sheriff Thorn squinted, his good humor souring. Who's that? Step forward and show yourself. You bid 50? The stranger took a slow step out of the shadows. The sun hit his face, revealing features that were hard and angular, as if carved from rock, and weathered by a harsh wind. He had a square jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth that was set in a firm, unsmiling line. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a stormy sky, a deep, turbulent gray, and they were fixed not on the sheriff, but on her. In them, she saw no pity, no lust, no judgment. She saw nothing. A vast, empty expanse that was somehow more terrifying and yet more comforting than anything else she had faced today. I said 50, the man repeated, his voice even. Thorns. Eyes narrowed, taking in the stranger's worn clothes, the calloused hands, the lack of any obvious wealth. $50 is a lot of coin, friend. You got it on you? The stranger didn't answer. He simply reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a handful of gold coins. He tossed one into the air, caught it, and held it up. It glinted in the sun, a small defiant star. The crowd gasped. That was more than $50. Much more. Thorn's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He had been challenged, his authority questioned by an outsider. The bid is 50, he snarled. Anyone care to raise it? 60? He looked hopefully at Jed the trapper, at the saloon owner. But they were silent, their bravado shrinking under the weight of the stranger's gold and his unnerving stare. The rest of the crowd was silent too, caught in the sudden crackling tension. Going once, Thorn said, his voice tight with fury. Going twice. He glared at the stranger, who met his gaze without flinching. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Thorn slammed the gavel down on the ledger with a crack that made Ilara jump. Sold to the stranger for $50. The deal was done. A wave of dizziness washed over Alara. She had been sold. But to whom? The stranger moved then, his steps slow and deliberate as he approached the auction block. The crowd parted. For him, a silent human sea. He walked past the fuming sheriff, his stormy eyes never leaving Alara's. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the scent of sage and clean earth on him, a stark contrast to the sour stench of the town. He looked at the rope on her wrists, then up at her face. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in those gray depths, a ghost of a pain that seemed to recognize her own. He didn't say a word to her. He reached out, not with the gold, but with a small, sharp knife he drew from his belt. With a single fluid motion, he sliced through the rope that bound her. It fell away, landing softly in the dust. Her hands were free. He then turned to the sheriff, his hand outstretched, palm up. He dropped 3 heavy gold coins into Thorne's hand. "The 50 for the debt," he said, his voice low and rumbling. "And another 50 for her horse and saddle. I'm told they were sold to you." Thorne's eyes bulged at the sight of the gold, his greed warring with his anger. Greed won. He snatched the coins. "The horse is in the livery." The stranger nodded once. He turned back to Alara, who stood frozen, her freed hands clasped in front of her, as if she still felt the phantom bite of the rope. He stood there for a long moment, the entire town watching, waiting. The silence was a held breath. What would he do now? Drag her away? Claim his prize? He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice so low it was meant only for her, yet it seemed to echo in the cavern of her soul. "You are free," he said. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone on the block, the dust settling around her, the whispers of the crowd rising like the buzz of locusts in the stunned, silent air. He had bought her, freed her, and then abandoned her, all in the space of 5 minutes. She watched his broad back recede, a solitary figure moving toward the livery, and a single terrifying question screamed in her mind. What now? The dust didn't settle. It swirled in the wake of his departure, a physical manifestation of the chaos in her mind. He had said, "You are free," but the words were a cruel joke. Free to do what? Starve in the street? Sell herself for a meal? A transaction far more debasing than the one that had just occurred. The crowd began to disperse, their drama over, leaving Alara alone on her stage of shame. Sheriff Thorne shot her a look of pure venom before stalking back into his office, slamming the door behind him. She was invisible again, a piece of refuse left behind after the show. She slowly, shakily, stepped down from the block, her legs trembling. The ground felt unsteady, as if the world had tilted on its axis. She was standing there, a ghost in the sun-drenched square, when he returned. He was leading her mare, Daisy, a gentle, sway-backed creature with soft brown eyes. He had saddled her. He walked right up to her and held out the reins. She stared at them, uncomprehending. "Take them," he said. His voice was not unkind, just flat, devoid of emotion. She reached out a trembling hand and her fingers brushed. His skin was rough, calloused, but there was a surprising warmth to it. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, the first human touch she'd felt in months that wasn't a threat. She took the reins. "I have a ranch," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if looking at her directly was too much of an effort. "North of here, a day's ride. It's not much. But there's a roof. And food." He paused. "I need a housekeeper." A housekeeper. The word was both a lifeline and an insult. It was what Thorne had auctioned her for. But coming from this man, it sounded different. It sounded like a job, a position, not servitude. "Or," he continued, his gaze finally dropping to meet hers, "there's this." He reached into his pouch again and held out another gold coin. This will get you to San Antonio. A new start." She stared at the coin, then at his face. He was offering her a choice. Her, the barren woman. The used goods. After a day of being treated as less than human, the simple act of being given a choice was so overwhelming, so staggering, that she couldn't speak. He was offering her a way out, a clean break. But as she looked past him at the dusty, judgmental street, at the closed doors and curtained windows, she knew there was no new start for a woman like her. Her story would follow her, a shadow she could never outrun. Here, at least, the story was known. And here, in front of her, was the one man who had looked at her shame and not flinched. Why? She finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why did you do it?" His jaw tightened. A muscle worked in his cheek. "I don't like bullies," he said simply. It wasn't the whole truth. She could see it in the depths of his stormy eyes. There was something else there, something deeper, a pain that resonated with the raw, gaping wound in her own soul. He was a broken man. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. Two broken souls in the dust of redemption. She looked at the gold coin in his hand, then at the reins in hers. San Antonio was a dream. This ranch, this stranger, this was real. It was a harsh, uncertain reality, but it was something to hold on to. "I can keep a house," she said, her voice a little stronger now. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand to help her mount. He simply turned and walked to his own horse, a powerful black stallion that watched them with intelligent eyes. He swung himself into the saddle with an easy, practiced grace. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just started riding north, out of town, his back straight, his shoulders broad, a silent, solitary figure moving toward the horizon. Alara took a deep breath, the air still thick with the taste of shame, but now mixed with something else. A tiny, fragile sliver of hope. She put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself onto Daisy's back. She looked one last time at the town of redemption, a place that had taken everything from her. Then she turned her horse and followed the stranger into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The ride was a silent one. The stranger, who she eventually learned was named Caleb, never spoke. He set a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his body relaxed in the saddle in a way that spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. Alara followed a few paces behind, the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves the only sound between them. The sun beat down and the landscape grew wilder, the dusty plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and prickly pear. Cactus. They rode until the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Just as dusk was settling, casting long, eerie shadows across the land, they crested a hill, and he finally pulled his horse to a stop. Below them, nestled in a small windswept valley, was the ranch. "It's not much," he had said. It was an understatement. The place was a study in decay. The cabin was a small, lopsided structure of rough-hewn logs, the roof sagging in the middle, like a tired old man's spine. The barn next to it leaned at a precarious angle, as if a strong wind might topple it. The fences were a patchwork of broken rails and wire, and the land itself looked hard and unforgiving, choked with rocks and weeds. A few scrawny cattle stood near a muddy water trough, their ribs showing. The whole place seemed to be saturated with a profound loneliness, a physical manifestation of the emptiness she had seen in Caleb's eyes. This was not a home, it was a hiding place. A place where a man went to forget the world, or to be forgotten by it. Caleb dismounted and began to unsaddle his horse without a word. Alara slid from Daisy's back, her muscles aching from the long ride. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the tall, dry grass. It was a lonely, desolate sound. He led the horses to the leaning barn. She followed him inside. The interior was dark and smelled of hay and manure. He lit a lantern, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He worked with an efficient, silent economy of motion, feeding and watering the animals. She stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure of what to do. "The well is over there," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a stone well near the cabin. "There's a bucket." It wasn't an order, but a statement of fact. She understood. This was the beginning of her work. She found the bucket and lowered it into the well, the rope rough against her hands. The water she drew was cold and clear. She carried 2 heavy buckets back to the cabin, her arms straining. The door creaked open on rusted hinges. The inside was even more grim than the outside. It was a single room, dark and cluttered. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth black with soot. A rough wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow bed with a thin, lumpy mattress was pushed against the far wall. The floor was dirt, packed hard and uneven. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like funeral shrouds. It was the home of a man who had given up. Caleb entered behind her, carrying their saddlebags. He dropped them on the floor with a thud. He looked around the squalid room, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something akin to shame in his eyes. He had brought her here. To this. "There's bacon and beans," he said, gesturing to a small crate in the corner. "The bedroom is through there." He pointed to a rough blanket hanging over a doorway. She looked at the blanket, then at the single bed. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Wifely duties without the wedding ring. That's what Thorne had said. Was this it? Was this the price of her rescue? As if reading her mind, Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's your room," he said, his voice rough. "I sleep in the barn." He turned and walked out before she could respond, the door creaking shut behind him, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence of the cabin. She stood there for a long time, the weight of the day, the week, the last 3 months, crashing down on her. She was in the middle of nowhere, in the home of a stranger, a man who slept in his barn like an animal. She looked around the filthy room, at the single bed that was hers, at the dirt floor, at the thick layer of another person's neglect. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and bitter. She had escaped the public humiliation of redemption only to find herself in this private desolation. But then, she looked at her hands. Her own 2 hands, they were not bound. She thought of Caleb's words, "You are free." She thought of the choice he had given her. A housekeeper. It was a job. And this was her workplace. A wave of something fierce and stubborn rose up in her, pushing back the despair. She had been called barren, useless, a fruitless vine. They had tried to break her. But she was not broken. She was a survivor. She took a deep breath, the air thick with dust and neglect. She walked over to the crate of supplies. She found the bacon and the beans. She found a skillet crusted with old grease. She went back to the well and drew more water. She found a rag and began to scrub. She would not weep. She would work. She would scour the filth from this place, and perhaps, in doing so, she could scour the shame from her own soul. She built a fire in the hearth, the small flame a defiant spark against the encroaching darkness. And as she cooked a simple meal of beans and bacon, the smell of food filling the small cabin for what felt like the first time in a very long time, she made a silent vow. She would earn her keep. She would make this broken-down cabin a home. And she would show this broken man and herself that she was not useless. She was Alara Vance, and she was still here. The days that followed bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of hard labor and heavy silence. Caleb was a ghost in his own home. He rose before dawn, gone from the barn before she was awake, and returned after dusk, his face etched with fatigue. He spent his days out on the range, mending the endless stretches of broken fences, tending to his scrawny herd. his presence marked only by the distant, rhythmic sound of his hammer. He was a man who seemed to be at war with the land itself, trying to beat it into submission through sheer force of will. Ilura's war was with the cabin. It was a battle fought with lye soap and boiling water, with a stiff bristled brush and aching muscles. She scrubbed the soot from the fireplace until the stones were clean. She beat the dust from the lumpy mattress and aired it in the sun. She patched the holes in the walls with a mixture of mud and grass. She swept the dirt floor until it was smooth and even. She washed the single window until the light streamed in, cutting through the gloom. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to reclaim the space from years of neglect. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a series of gestures and necessities. She would leave a plate of food on the table for him when he returned at night. He would find it gone in the morning, the plate washed and stacked neatly. He left a pail of fresh milk on the doorstep each dawn, from a single sad-eyed cow he kept in the barn. She would use it to make biscuits or a simple pudding. They were two planets in a silent orbit, circling the same empty space, their paths never quite crossing. The silence was the hardest part. It was a living entity, thick and suffocating. It was filled with all the things they didn't say, all the grief they carried. She knew he was haunted. She could hear him sometimes, late at night, the sound of a muffled cry or a sudden sharp gasp carrying from the barn on the wind. She knew he had nightmares. She had them too, dreams of the auction block, of Thorne's leering face, of Samuel's dying breaths. They were two wounded animals, holed up in their separate dens, too afraid to show their pain. One afternoon, a week after she arrived, she found a small half-dead rosebush near the well, choked by weeds. Its leaves were yellowed, its stems brittle, but on one branch, a single pale pink bud clung to life. She spent the rest of the day clearing the weeds, loosening the hard-packed soil, and giving it water. It was a small, foolish act of hope. In this desolate place, but it was hers. Caleb returned that evening and saw her kneeling by the bush. He stopped, his shadow falling over her. She looked up, expecting a comment, perhaps a dismissive grunt. He just stood there, his stormy eyes fixed on the fragile bud. He looked at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and went to the barn. The next morning, she found a pile of rich, dark manure next to the rosebush, a silent offering, a shared investment in a single tiny spot of beauty. It was the first conversation they'd had. Slowly, the rhythm of their life began to change. The silence was still there, but it was less heavy, less oppressive. It became a shared silence, a comfortable space rather than an empty one. He started taking his evening meal at the table, instead of disappearing into the barn. He would sit across from her, his big calloused hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his eyes staring into the fire. She would sew, mending his worn shirts, the soft scratch of her needle the only sound. He began to teach her things. He showed her how to set a snare, how to read the tracks of a deer, how to handle the old rifle he kept above the fireplace. He was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse but clear. Keep your elbow tucked, squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. Lead the rabbit. She was a quick learner. The first time she hit the tin can he'd set on a fence post, a flicker of something, pride, surprise, crossed his face before the mask of stoicism slammed back into place. Holding the rifle, feeling its solid weight, gave her a sense of power she had never known. She was not just a victim. She could defend herself. She could provide. In return, she brought a semblance of life to the ranch. She planted a small garden. Behind the cabin, her hands in the soil a soothing balm. She coaxed green shoots from the stubborn earth beans, squash, corn. She started finding wildflowers on her walks and placing them in a tin can on the table. The cabin began to smell of baking bread and drying herbs instead of dust and despair. One evening, as a storm rolled in, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the window, the roof of the barn finally gave way with a great groan and a crash. Caleb came into the cabin, soaked to the skin, his face grim. "The roof's gone," he said. "Are the animals all right?" She asked, her first thought for the horses and the cow. He nodded. "I got them out." He stood dripping on the floor, looking lost. His sanctuary, his hiding place, was breached. "You'll sleep in here tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. She took the blankets from her bed and made a pallet for him on the floor by the fire. He didn't argue. He just watched her, his gray eyes filled with a strange, vulnerable light. That night, the storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, it was warm and dry. She lay in her bed, and he lay on the floor, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady. For the first time, they were sharing the same space, weathering the same storm. The barrier between them, the one he had so carefully constructed, had been broken. He had a nightmare. He cried out, a strangled guttural sound of pure agony. "No, please. Not. My boy." Elara sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. She lit the lamp and went to him. He was thrashing on the pallet, his face contorted in a mask of grief, his hands clenched. "Caleb," she whispered, touching his shoulder. "Caleb, wake up." His eyes flew open. They were wild, unfocused, filled with a raw, terrifying pain. He stared at her, but he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing a ghost. "Sarah?" He rasped, his voice thick with tears. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't, the fever." And then the story tumbled out of him, a torrent of grief held back for years. He had a wife, Sarah, a son, Daniel. They had built this ranch together. It was supposed to be their paradise. But a fever had swept through, swift and merciless. It took his boy first, then his wife, all within a week. He had buried them himself, on the hill overlooking the valley. He had been alone ever since, punishing himself, letting the ranch, their dream, crumble around him. He wept then, not silently as she did, but with great, shuddering sobs that shook his entire body. He wept for his lost wife, his lost son, his lost life. Elara didn't say anything. There were no words for a grief that vast. She simply sat beside him on the floor, her hand on his back, a small, steady point of contact in the storm of his sorrow. She let him grieve. She bore witness to his pain. And in that dark, storm-tossed cabin, as one broken soul finally shared his burden with another, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. The morning after the storm was quiet and clean, the air washed fresh. Caleb was already outside when she awoke, surveying the damage to the barn. The collapsed roof looked like the broken skeleton of some great beast. He stood staring at it, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his confessed grief still heavy on him. Elara brought him a cup of coffee. He took it without looking at her, his eyes still fixed on the ruin. "It's a big job," she said softly. "I can't do it alone," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time he had ever admitted to needing help. "Then you won't," she replied. And so they began to rebuild. It was backbreaking work. They salvaged what timber they could and hauled new logs from the woods. He taught her how to use a saw, how to notch the logs, how to lift and place them. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher. Her muscles, already strong, grew stronger. They worked from sunup to sundown, a team, moving with an unspoken rhythm. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with shared purpose. One afternoon, as they were struggling to hoist a heavy beam into place, their hands brushed. He didn't pull away. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. It wasn't just shared grief and shared labor anymore. It was something else, something fragile and terrifying and beautiful. He looked at her, his stormy eyes searching her face, and for a fleeting moment, she thought he might lean in, that he might kiss her. The thought sent a flock of birds taking flight in her stomach, but the moment passed. He cleared his throat, looked away, and said, "We need more leverage." The rebuilding of the barn became the rebuilding of them. With every log they set in place, they were laying a new foundation. They started talking more, sharing small pieces of their pasts. She told him about her mother, about her love of reading, a luxury she hadn't had in years. He told her about his father, a carpenter who had taught him how to build. They were like two people learning a new language, hesitant at first, then growing more confident with each word. They had to go to Redemption for supplies, nails, rope, a new saw blade. The thought of returning filled Ilara with a cold dread. Caleb seemed to sense it. "I'll be with you," he said, the night before they were to leave. It was a simple promise, but it was everything. The town was just as she remembered it, dusty and judgmental. As they rode down the main street, heads turned. Whispers followed them like a swarm of flies. "There they are, the rancher who bought the widow. Look at her, brazen as you please." Ilara kept her head high, her eyes fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the heat of their stares. They went to the general store first. The storekeeper, a man who had once refused her credit, was now all smiles and deference to Caleb, who laid a stack of coins on the counter. As they were leaving, a woman, the pastor's wife, stopped them. She was a kind, gentle soul who had always had a friendly word for Ilara. "Ilara, dear," she said, her eyes warm with genuine concern. "It is good to see you looking well." She glanced at Caleb, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, then back at Ilara. She pressed a small cloth-wrapped bundle into Ilara's hands. "Some yeast," she whispered, "for your baking." It was a small gesture, but it was an act of solidarity, a crack in the wall of the town's condemnation. Ilara felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she managed to say. Their last stop was the blacksmith. As Caleb was negotiating for the nails, Sheriff Thorne appeared, blocking the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed over his big belly, a smug, contemptuous smirk on his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his eyes raking over Ilara. "Look what the cat dragged in. Or should I say, what the lonely rancher dragged out to his hovel." He looked at Caleb. "Enjoying your purchase, friend? Getting your $50 worth?" Caleb went still. The friendly warmth in the forge seemed to vanish, replaced by an icy cold. He turned slowly, his body coiled like a snake ready to strike. "You have business with me, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Just making conversation," Thorne said, his smirk widening. "Just wondering if the goods are satisfactory. I hear she's a bit defective, a barren field, you might say. You can plow it all you want, but nothing's ever gonna grow." Ilara flinched as if he had struck her. The old shame, the raw wound, ripped open again. She felt the blood drain from her face, but before the despair could take hold, Caleb moved. He took a step forward, placing himself between her and the sheriff. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply looked at Thorne, his stormy gray eyes turning to black thunderheads. "The next time you speak to her," Caleb said, his voice a low, deadly rumble, "you will call her Mrs. Holly, and the next time you speak of her, you will do it with respect. Or I will take that tin star you wear and shove it so far down your throat you'll be tasting it for a month." The air in the blacksmith's shop was thick enough to cut with a knife. The blacksmith froze, his hammer hovering in midair. Thorne's smirk faltered. He was a bully used to preying on the weak. He wasn't used to being challenged by a man who looked like he could snap him in two without breaking a sweat. He blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. "That's threatening an officer of the law." "That's a promise," Caleb corrected him. He held Thorn's gaze for a long silent moment, an unbreakable force of will. Thorn was the first to look away. He muttered something under his breath and pushed himself off the doorframe, stalking away down the street. Caleb stood there for a moment, his back still to her. Then he turned. He looked at her, his eyes no longer angry, but filled with a fierce, protective light. He reached out and gently, almost hesitantly, touched her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had defended her. He had claimed her, not as a purchase, but as his Mrs. Hawley. He had given her his name. In that moment, standing in the heat of the forge, with the smell of coal and iron in the air, she knew she was no longer just his housekeeper, and he was no longer just her rescuer. They were something more, something new, something that was beginning to feel terrifyingly like family. They rode back to the ranch, the new name hanging in the air between them, Mrs. Holla. It felt foreign on her tongue, yet it settled in her heart with a surprising warmth. He had given her a shield, a cloak of respectability to wear against the scorn of the world. But it was more than that. It was a claim. The barn was finished by the time the first chill of autumn touched the air. It stood tall and straight, a testament to their shared labor. It was stronger than the old one, its foundation solid, its roof tight against the sky. Caleb moved back into his small room off the main stable, but the cabin no longer felt empty. The door between their two worlds was now permanently open. He ate every meal at the table. They talked every evening by the fire. He even brought her a book he'd found in a dusty crate, a worn copy of Shakespeare. She would read aloud to him, her voice filling the small cabin, and he would listen, his eyes closed, a rare, soft expression on his face. The rosebush by the well, nurtured by her care and his offering, had bloomed. It was covered in pale pink blossoms, a defiant splash of color against the harsh landscape. It was their rosebush. The fragile peace they had built was shattered on a cold, gray morning in late October. Alara was kneading bread dough when she saw them, 3 riders cresting the hill, heading for the valley. Her heart seized. One of the riders was Sheriff Thorn. Caleb was in the new barn, mending a harness. She ran, her skirts flying, her hands still white with flour. "Caleb, riders, it's the sheriff." He came out, wiping his hands on a rag, his face instantly hardening into the stony mask she had first seen in Redemption. He watched the riders approach, his body tense. "Go inside, Alara," he said, his voice low. "Lock the door." "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm staying with you." She stood her ground, her chin lifted. She would not hide. Not anymore. He looked at her, and a flicker of pride warmed his eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. "All right, stay behind me." Thorn and his 2 deputies, thuggish men who were more cronies than lawmen, reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin. Thorn had a smug, triumphant look on his face. He held up a piece of paper. "Halle." He called out, his voice dripping with mock formality. "I have here an official notice of eviction." Caleb's face remained impassive. "On what grounds?" "Seems there was an unpaid tax lien on this property from 5 years ago," Thorn said, clearly. "Enjoying himself. Before your time. An oversight by the county clerk, but the law is the law. The debt has come due, with interest. The town of Redemption has paid it, and now this land, this ranch, it belongs to the town." He smirked. "And I, as the town's representative, am here to take possession." It was a lie, a fabrication, a desperate, cruel power play. They both knew it, but he had a piece of paper and 2 armed men. "This is my land," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "I have the deed, paid for and filed." "Your deed is worthless." Thorn sneered. "This lien predates it. You can take it up with the judge in Austin, but by the time you get there, this place will be mine." Now you have 1 hour to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises." His eyes slid to Alara, a greasy possessive gleam in them. "The woman, of course, stays. She's part of the property now. Squatters' rights don't apply to livestock." A blind, white-hot rage surged through Alara. All the humiliation, all the fear, all the pain he had inflicted on her coalesced into a single point of fiery defiance. Before Caleb could move, before he could speak, she stepped out. From behind him, "You will not have this land," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, across the valley. Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who's going to stop me? You? The barren widow?" "Yes," she said, taking another step forward. "Me." She looked him dead in the eye, her own gaze burning with a fire he had never seen before. "You are right. Sheriff, I am a barren woman. My body will never grow a child. This land." She swept her arm out, indicating the cabin, the new barn, the small garden, the single blooming rosebush. "This is my child. We bled for this land. We poured our sweat and our tears into this soil. We broke our backs to raise that barn from the dead. Every nail, every log, every stone is a part of us. This is the only legacy we will ever have, and we will die for it." Her voice, filled with a passion and a pain that was breathtakingly real, echoed in the silence. Even Thorn's deputies looked uneasy. Her words had transformed the dispute from a legal matter to something primal, something sacred. "This is our home," she finished, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, "and you are not welcome here." "She's right," a new voice said. They all turned. Standing at the edge of the valley, having approached on foot, were the blacksmith and the pastor's wife. And behind them, a dozen other townspeople, farmers, storekeepers, wives who had followed the posse out from town, drawn by the scent of injustice. The blacksmith, a burly man with soot permanently ingrained in his skin, held a heavy hammer in his hand. "We heard your talk in the saloon, Thorn," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We know this lien is a sham. We won't let you do this." The pastor's wife stepped forward. "This man and woman have built something good here," she said, her voice clear and steady. "They have taken a broken place and made it whole. That is a holier act than any piece of paper you can forge." Thorn looked from the defiant couple to the silent, watching crowd. His face, which had been so smug, was now pale with fury and a dawning fear. His power was built on the town's fear and apathy. But he was losing them. He was losing control. "This is official business," he blustered, waving the paper. "I am the law." "You are a bully and a thief," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the air. He took a step forward, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip. "And your time as the law in this valley is over. Now get off my land." It was a standoff. The air was thick with the promise of violence. Thorn looked at Caleb's cold, determined face. He looked at Alara, no longer a victim, but a lioness protecting her territory. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, no longer a jeering crowd, but a silent jury that had already passed sentence on him. He was alone. With a curse, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over." He snarled, but his threat was empty. He spurred his horse, his deputies scrambling to follow, and they galloped away, a retreat of shame under the watchful eyes of the entire valley. The townspeople slowly approached, their faces a mixture of relief and admiration. The blacksmith walked up to Caleb and clapped him on the shoulder. "Well done, Hale," he said. The pastor's wife hugged Alara. "We are with you," she whispered. Alara stood beside Caleb, watching the last of their supporters depart, leaving them in the quiet of their valley. The threat was gone. They had faced the final test, and they had not just survived, they had won. She looked at Caleb, at his strong, weathered profile, and her heart felt so full it might burst. He turned to her, his stormy eyes soft now, filled with a love and a respect that was more profound than any passion. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. "Mrs. Halle," he said softly, a small, true smile finally reaching his eyes. "I believe you called this our home." "I did," she whispered, her own tears finally falling, not in sorrow, but in overwhelming, cleansing joy. "Then I think it's time we made it official," he said. "In the eyes of God and everyone, if you'll have me." It wasn't a marriage of convenience he was offering. It was a marriage of the heart, of the soul. A marriage forged in shared pain, built with shared labor, and sealed by a shared victory. She didn't need to answer with words. She simply squeezed his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder, the two of them standing together in the fading light, two broken souls made whole. They were married a week later, not in a church, but right there, in their valley, under the wide-open Texas sky. The blacksmith and his wife stood as witnesses. Ilara wore a simple blue dress, and in her hair, she had tucked one of the pink blossoms from their rosebush. Caleb, in a clean shirt, looked at her as if she were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The pastor, who had come out from town, read from the Bible, his voice gentle and kind. When he pronounced them man and wife, Caleb didn't kiss her with a fiery passion. He touched her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of reverence, of a deep and abiding love that had grown slowly, quietly, in the most desolate of places. Their home, once a symbol of their brokenness, was now a sanctuary. Laughter filled the small cabin. The fire in the hearth burned bright and warm. Scars remained on the land and in their hearts, but they were no longer sources of shame. They were reminders of the battles they had fought and won together. They were proof of their resilience. That evening, they stood on the porch of their cabin, hand in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, but it was no longer a lonely silence. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the comfortable presence of another soul. Ilara leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder, her heart settled and calm. She thought of the woman who had stood on the auction block, shamed and broken, her spirit nearly extinguished. She thought of the man who had hidden from the world, drowning in his grief. They had been two separate, shattered pieces. Now they were something new, something whole, something strong. Caleb wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. He looked out at the land, their home, their child. He looked at them. New barn, standing straight and true against the darkening sky. He looked at the small, determined rosebush, still blooming defiantly as the season turned toward winter. He had come to this valley to die. But this woman, this fierce, gentle, unbreakable woman, had taught him how to live again. He looked down at her, at the top of her head resting against his chest, and a feeling of profound, overwhelming gratitude washed over him. The world had done its best to destroy them, to grind them into the dust from which they had come. But it had failed. He held her tighter, breathing in the scent of her hair, and whispered the truest words he had ever spoken into the quiet of the coming night. "The world tried to bury us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It didn't know. We were seeds,